Germany's government was accountable not to her people, via the Reichstag, but to her emperor. The call for political reform was growing loud, but Germany entered the First World War governed by an autocrat, and his character was as burdened by paradox as his country was.
One day, the Kaiser is a soldier king, rigid, traditional. Suddenly, he's the reform king, embracing the worker as a brother. Next, he is the modern king, treating the past with contempt, regarding the factory as a temple with electricity powering all of Germany.
Kaiser Wilhelm II was Queen Victoria's oldest grandson, cousin to both Britain's George V and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. Wilhelm was born with a withered left arm for which he compensated with sports, sailing, riding and hunting. He had an immature streak, dressing up and playing often cruel practical jokes. Wilhelm's right arm was incredibly powerful. With his rings turned inwards, he would squeeze the hands of visiting dignitaries so hard they would cry out. A king's insecurities matter little if he has no power, but the Kaiser was Germany's commander-in-chief, its supreme warlord.
In no area has the Kaiser views of his own, and he doesn't know what to do. Sadly, he's putty in the hands of clever people and makes surprising leaps of judgment all over the place. Everything he decides is motivated by his desire to be popular.
The Kaiser was most comfortable in the company of his officers. He was obsessed with uniforms and militarism. His army's ethos was rigidly professional, though even in peacetime half were conscripts. They were highly disciplined and the guardians of the German state. The French were old enemies. The last time they'd fought, in 1870, the French had used civilian snipers, franc-tireurs, against them. The German Chief of Staff's own uncle led that campaign and passed on the crucial lesson to the German soldiers of 1914.
International rules do not work when soldiers are in constant fear for their lives, worried that a civilian may pick up a rifle and shoot them. It must also be remembered that the greatest deed in war is the speedy ending of the war, and every means to that end must remain open.
German troops going into Belgium and France used terror from the start. The civilian population, caught between the weight of historic fears and current military necessities, was not going to get the benefit of any doubt. Belgian and French forces bore the brunt of the German onslaught. They were soon joined by British troops. In all, 100,000 men of the British Expeditionary Force crossed the Channel in the early weeks of the war. On the 21st of August, British troops moved into position alongside the French Fifth Army near the Belgian town of Mons, close to the French border. Two days later, the British, with 70,000 men, were hit by a German force 4 times the size.
I focused the telescope and saw a number of little grey figures. More and more were appearing. Women started to wail and rushed for home, followed by the men. while children, torn by curiosity, lagged behind, turning to see. In a few seconds, all these civilians were fleeing along the roads.
The Allies started an epic retreat south, just ahead of the German tidal wave. The war on the Western Front did not begin in the trenches. These early months were mobile, fast, dangerous. In the first 4 weeks, the German army lost over 250,000 men killed, wounded, and missing. The front was constantly shifting, giving men no time to dig in. There was nowhere to hide in fields swept by machine guns and rapid-firing artillery. British soldier Edward Dwyer won the Victoria Cross on Hill 60 in Belgium. He was just 19. He recalled the retreat from Mons on a sound recording made in 1915. He was killed a year later.
I was already in the army when the war broke out and went to France on August 13, 1914. You people over here don't realize what our boys went through in those days. That march from Mons was a nightmare. Unless you've been through it, you can't imagine what an agonizing time it was. We used to do from 20 to 25 miles a day. There was only one thing you could cheer us up on the march, that was singing. We're here because we're here, because we're here, because we're here. We're here because we're here, because we're here, because we're here.
France has just been the object of a violent and premeditated attack. She will be heroically defended by all her sons. Nothing will break their sacred union. Once again, she stands before the universe for liberty, justice, and reason. Vive la France!
At the war's start, Poincaré had appealed to all France for national unity. By the 2nd of September 1914, the Germans were just 30 miles from Paris, and the sacred union was starting to crack. Trenches were dug, sandbags filled, barricades erected. The government left the capital for Bordeaux, triggering a general exodus. 1 million Parisians, a third of its inhabitants, fled the city. The fate of Paris and France would be decided on the River Marne. Fought along a 300-mile front, it was a battle France had to win. But although the Germans had their enemy's capital almost in sight, their advance was outstripping supply lines. There were few lorries in 1914. Horses pulled the guns and wagons. General von Moltke, the German commander, grew alarmed.
We have hardly any horses left in the army which can take another step. We don't want to fool ourselves. We've had successes, but we're not victorious yet. Victory means annihilation of the enemy's resistance. But where are all the French prisoners and guns we should have been capturing? The French have retreated in a disciplined way according to a plan. The most difficult time lies ahead of us.
The German right wing was sweeping down towards Paris. The French had detached troops from the east, moving them by rail to Paris to attack the Germans in their flank. The Allies now outnumbered the Germans and chose their moment to strike. As the Germans neared Paris, a dangerous gap opened up between their First and Second Armies. The British Expeditionary Force would be driven in like a wedge.
To the French, it is their own home, and it makes them mad. We somehow fight on with no increased animosity. But the French really are giving everything, and it makes one wonder if people in England realise what the advance of an invading army over a country means.
On the eve of battle, the French commander-in-chief, Marshal Joffre, addressed his officers.
When a battle begins upon which the nation's salvation depends, we cannot look back. We must make every effort to attack and repel the enemy. Troops who can no longer advance must, at all cost, hold the captured ground and die rather than retreat.
The Marne would consign the set-piece battle, fought on a single field in a day, to history. It was on the cusp between old warfare and new. Around Paris, great armies wheeled and manoeuvred as they had done for centuries. But to the east, the French dug trenches to defend their positions. Here, the battle lines would become static. The Battle of the Marne began on the 5th of September, 1914.
The fighting has begun. French shells explode incessantly in front of us. We seek shelter in a sunken lane. Stomachs loudly remind us of our hunger. Constant shelling makes it impossible to reach up and fetch an apple. Some block their ears so as not to lose their nerve with the incessant machine gun fire. Our ranks are decimated. We cannot hold this position much longer.
Pieces of shrapnel whistled past me. I felt I'd been hit. My knee was giving way as I walked. I wasn't sure what had happened. I stopped and pushed my finger through a hole in my trousers. My finger kept on going into my leg.
We turn towards the gunfire that rattles out on our right beyond Barcy, where the shrapnel still rains down. The houses are burning. I hear from both sides, it's our own guns shooting at us. I stick very close to the ground, face against the earth.
For all its modernity, there were elements of the battle that Napoleon would have recognized. Cavalry, armed with lances, played an active role. No one wore tin helmets. And as these original colour photographs of the Marne show, some soldiers' uniforms owed more to the parade ground than to the needs of camouflage. There were easy targets in the early months.
My rifle went to my shoulder. 2 Frenchmen fell. I fired again. Nothing. My magazine was empty. I reached for my bayonet. I expected to be killed by a bullet any second. But then the rest of my men burst through the undergrowth, and the enemy vanished.
The Germans were in a shade of field grey, but the British were even more difficult to spot, as another German enviously noted.
The colour of the English clothing is much more suited to the terrain than ours. It's a sort of browny green, a really dirty colour. This really is an advantage, although we're still going to win.